Faculty panel on refugees. I'm Beth Doherty from the Political Science Department. I will be joined this afternoon by Ed Mustin from German, Michel Boumete from French, and Pablo Tural, also of the Political Science Department. We're each going to cover different facets of the refugee crisis, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I would just also like to remind everyone that Eskinder Nagash's annual Weissberg address will be Wednesday night in the chapel at 7 o'clock, so please come out for that as well. I'm going to start off doing just a general overview of the situation of refugees and to do a little bit of the terminology, because actually there are a number of terms that people tend to use as if they are interchangeable when in fact they have significant legal differences in them. Whenever I talk about refugees, I always start with this slide. It's from a site that is collecting artwork by Syrian refugees, and it's graffiti that was on the side of a home in Homs in Syria. And it reads, "When I leave, be sure to know that I did everything I could to stay." I think it's important to remember the human aspect of this, and that people actually who are refugees are in fact forcibly displaced. According to the UNHCR, right, there are currently 65 million displaced people in the world. That's 21 million refugees, nearly 41 million internally displaced persons, and over 3 million asylum seekers. This is the highest number of forcibly displaced persons that we have ever seen. This just gives you a nice historical overview. Starting in 1989, and so you can see the internally displaced and refugee populations on this. The three main things there, of course, the Rwanda genocide, the war in Afghanistan, and the Syrian civil war are probably three of the largest, most recent outflows of refugees. Refugee actually has a legal definition according to the 1951 definition or 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees. A refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and unable to, or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. I think it is critical with this definition to recognize the notion of persecution, but also that this individual is unable to have his own government protect them. This is an individual determination. Every country has their own refugee status determination process, but frequently we see large-scale mass movements of refugees. Many people crossing the border quickly as a result of war or other kinds of generalized violence. Oftentimes these individuals are not individually given refugee status, but are instead, as a group, considered to be prima facie refugees. This allows the international community to go in and to provide them with assistance. They would still need, however, to go through an individual status determination process to become a quote-unquote convention refugee. Internally displaced persons, as the name suggests, actually have not crossed an international border. Refugees have crossed an international border. Internally displaced persons have not. Internally displaced persons can be very difficult sometimes for the international community to reach them with humanitarian assistance, because if the state does not wish to allow the international community to come in, then there really isn't anything that the international community can do. A good example of that would have been the large number of displaced persons in Chechnya, where Russia was not willing to have the international community intervene. Internally displaced persons may also be fleeing for reasons other than persecution, whereas, again, convention refugees, persecution is integral to that definition. You also have asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are persons who wish to become designated as convention refugees. Every year, the United States designates a certain number of refugees will be allowed into the country, and then there is an additional number of people who may be able to get asylum status. It's usually fewer than 30,000 people a year in the United States will be recognized as a refugee through the asylum process. And then lastly, you have migrants. And the main difference between the migrants and the other categories has to do with forcible displacement, because migrants are not forcibly displaced. And secondly, again, that refugees are unable to avail themselves of the protection that they should be able to expect from their own governments, oftentimes because it is their own government that is responsible for their persecution. The UNHCR is the lead agency that coordinates all the hundreds of international humanitarian agencies that get involved with refugees. While it is a UN agency, it also is severely constrained in many ways by this, because it has to act in ways that reflect what state members of the UN would like. The other thing is that the UNHCR is almost entirely reliant on voluntary contributions from member states and from individuals. It does not get its money from the UN general budget. And UNHCR appeals frequently fall short of what the UNHCR says that it needs in order to provide humanitarian assistance to the populations over which it has responsibility. A number of years ago, the international community decided that someone needed to take care of internally displaced persons, and for lack of anywhere else to do, they placed that burden on the UNHCR. And so now that 65 million people who are forcibly displaced, nearly all of those are persons of concern to the UNHCR. This survey was taken with refugees in Syria, or refugees from Syria, rather, who were in Turkey, asking them what the main reason was for why they leave. And in this case, of course, unsurprisingly, most of them said they left because it was too dangerous to stay. And I'm not going to show you pictures of bombed out buildings. Instead, what I'd like to do is show you some artwork that was drawn by Syrian and Darfuri refugee children who are in art therapy, showing what their understanding is of the reasons why they have become refugees. These are before and after pictures drawn by Syrian children. Syria is the worst refugee crisis in our generation. Over half of the population of Syria is currently displaced. You will also note on this with Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, and some of these other cases, these refugees are what would be considered a protracted refugee situation. In other words, the population has been outside of the country of their origin for 5 years or more. In some cases, protracted refugee situations can go on for decades. This will give you an indication of where the main burden of the Syrian refugee crisis is being, who is supporting that. And contrary to popular opinion, it's not Europe and the United States who are bearing the brunt of this. As with most refugee crises, it is the neighboring states that are responsible for the majority of those refugees. As you can see, you have nearly 3 million Syrian refugees that have gone to Turkey. And I would just remind you that in Turkey, it's a different ethnic group. They speak a different language. Right? In Jordan and in Lebanon and Egypt and Iraq, the other places in the region where Syrians have gone, at least in those cases, they're able to speak Arabic when they arrive. 1 in every 13 persons in Jordan is a Syrian refugee. 1 in every 4 persons in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. This just gives you, again, another sense of the degree to which the burden is mainly being held by the countries that are closest to Syria and not so much to the United States or to the West European states. These are the top refugee hosting countries. And what I'd like you to notice with this is that most of these countries are poor. So the vast majority of the world's refugees actually are in poor countries, right? Which have their own economic problems, but nonetheless have been willing to do their part to try to work with the refugee burden. Countries per capita, again, Lebanon, Jordan, again, at the top. And just to give you a sense of where the United States is compared to these other, and some of the Europeans, again, despite what we all think because of the media, you can see that, in fact, this burden is disproportionately being held by countries that are in the region. This will show you the shifting origins of over time for the U.S. refugees. And I just would like to note that historically, the United States has allowed in many more refugees than we are currently willing to allow in. We had almost recovered to levels of pre-9/11, but then those numbers have fallen. And the United States has not been willing until the last year to allow in Syrian refugees, despite the fact that this is the largest refugee population in the world. The new administration will be able to decide what the refugee ceiling is for the United States for the next fiscal year. And obviously there is great concern that that number will be brought well below where it is now. And so with that, I will turn things over to Ed.
So I guess you have to go here.
There it is, there.
There it is.
Okay, perfect.
Is that it? Mm-hmm. Take it from there.
Okay. Hello. So thank you all for being here. Let's see. I thought I'd approach this week's topic by painting a portrait of France's stance on migration in larger brushstrokes for two main purposes. First, in many significant ways, France resembles the United States, and thus, through a comparative lens, I hope to shed light on immigration policies and the social climate in both countries. Second, since France has been and remains a crucial player in Europe and in the European Union, consequently, what happens in France impacts and influences surrounding countries. To start, the title of my presentation comes from the French philosopher Roland Barthes' 1957 book, Mythologie, in which he examines everyday myths and the myth-making process in modern societies by asking, what is a myth today? And here are two examples, two famous examples. On the left is the cover of Paris Match, a magazine that he supposedly saw in a barber shop, and that signifies the prowess of France's empire without explicitly saying so. And on the right, you have the Citroën DS, the DS, that's the name of the model of the car. And in French, it has the overtones of also meaning goddess. And so doing an analysis of both the image of the car and the language as well. I think identifying and understanding myths, particularly national ones, is crucial for grappling with how nations address, both formally and informally, the question of migration in all its complexity. It is now that I'd like to turn to a couple of key French myths that complicate while also providing insight to what is currently going on in France. So one of the first ones is the fact that France prides itself on being the birthplace of the Declaration of the Rights of Man that was signed in August of 1789. And for those of you who know your American history, yes, this is after the Declaration of the Rights of Independence from the US, well, by the US to England, but it's before the actual American Bill of Rights, which is in 1791. So France prides itself on being the birthplace of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the citizen. This is also important because later, after World War II, it also becomes an important document for the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed in 1948. Linked to this legacy from the French Revolution and the birthplace of the rights of man from the Enlightenment, you also have this narrative of the French resistance during World War II. So you have Charles de Gaulle, who from London, with the help of the BBC, supported the French resistance from without France, and then went to France and helped support the resistance from within. And this becomes important later because this is part of France's national identity. And by choosing this myth, the myth of French resistance, you also then can shroud the myth of collaboration with the Nazis and Vichy France. So prioritizing one narrative over a different narrative becomes very important. Also important in the same context for this week is the notion of immigration in France. I would argue that the history of modern France is the history of immigration, despite the fact that many French historians wouldn't say that's the case. So here you have a cartoon that puts this into perspective. And this is actually in reference to a couple French historians in the 1980s, and one in particular, Pierre Nora, who went about writing the history of modern France in 3 volumes over the span of the 1980s and early 1990s. 3 volumes for the history of France and no words whatsoever about the history of immigration in France, even though it's constitutive to contemporary France. So this cartoon points to that history. So you have Pierre Nora, 3 volumes about the history of France, no mention of immigration, and then you have someone like Gerard Noiriel and Benjamin Stora that actually point to this history and point out that it's constitutive, as I mentioned, to contemporary France. So France has been accepting immigrants for a long time, and actually, alongside the US, has a high rate of immigration and has over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And this is impacted by different international events as well, and so I've listed some of the most important ones here. Late in the 19th century and early in the 20th century, the majority of the immigrants going to France were from other European countries, and this has to do with World Wars I and II, and also the Spanish Civil War, for example, so you have people fleeing locally to France, and they didn't have as much problem assimilating as non-European populations. Following World War II, France was destroyed, and so it needed to rebuild. And so you have France aggressively encouraging North Africans to go to France, and this becomes very complex because they're not actually immigrants. They're either French citizens in the case of Algeria, or French colonial subjects in the case of Moroccans and Tunisians directly following World War II. This actually ends with the OPEC oil crisis, and you have a tightening of France's immigration laws. And so over the course of the 80s and early 90s, you have the Pasqua laws, or known as the Pasqua laws, which effectively make immigration illegal into France, immigration into France almost illegal. And so here are some charts to put this into perspective as well. So this shows immigration over the 20th century, and the rates are very high. And so even though France would say that it doesn't have a high immigrant population, it actually does. So this is over the course of the 20th century. This is a breakdown of the place of origin. And so it shifts from Europe to North Africa for the most part, but this is because the state encouraged its subjects to come and help rebuild. Here, so in the middle where you start to see the decrease, that's a result of the OPEC oil crisis and the beginning of tightening of immigration laws to go with it. So you see a large decrease in the 80s and 90s, and this is also the rise of the conservative right at the same time as well. But then you see another rise start because of instability in the world as well. So the reason that myths are important is because they impact how we understand ourselves and the stories that we tell about ourselves. And so here's a comparison And I mentioned that France likes to pride itself on its French resistance history during World War II as opposed to its Vichy history, but in fact, there are still overtones alive today. And so here are two excerpts from two different laws. One was a Vichy ordinance that said that you, if you were harboring any Jews in your house, you had to notify the authorities within 24 hours. And recently, as part of the Pasqua laws in 1996, France passed a law saying that if you harbor any immigrants, you need to alert authorities as well, effectively kind of making it almost illegal to assist illegal immigrants in France. And so it's almost, it's condemned by the state, but it also creates this surveillance state as well. And so more recently, that's the background for France and what's going on. More recently, there has been a dramatic rise in asylum seekers in France in particular as a result of the international situation. And this is different for France because previously the majority of immigrants who were coming were either from other European countries or from French colonies or former colonies. And so there was at least a shared language. More recently, there is not a shared language. As well, you have France as not being the destination for a lot of these people. And so France, as a state, is trying to deal with these populations in the ways that it has been dealing with previous populations, and it's not working. And so there's a discrepancy. And in particular, a perfect example of this is the Calais jungle that it's in its first iteration started in 1999 and is still going on today. And if you want to know more about it, we will be showing a film next Wednesday in this room, Welcome, which addresses this particular situation. In the broader context of this week, what becomes evident through an investigation of French myths is the power of narratives to shape how we perceive facts, reality, and most importantly, other human beings. Thank you.
The title of my talk today is What's in a Name? Kenopolitics, Nomination, and Migration in Contemporary Germany. My name is Ed Mustin. I'm in the German Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. First of all, I'd like to thank Eskinder Nagash for being here this week, the Weissberg family for providing the funds, and the Weissberg Committee for organizing the series of events. I feel very privileged to be a part of it. In my first semester here at Beloit, I'm also very privileged to have worked with a talented group of students as we explore German history and identity from the perspective of migration. We started with the contemporary influx of refugees to Europe from ruined Syria and worked backwards through a guest worker program in the 1950s and 1960s, the persecution and exile of Jews and other groups under the Nazi regime, and will conclude in a few weeks with a consideration of the German Enlightenment and Jewish emancipation. The students in my class recently completed a series of posters exploring minority groups within Germany, such as the Sinti, the Sorbs, and Jews, as well as migrations of Germans to different European countries, Russia, and the Americas. And funding from these posters was provided by the Weissberg program, and you can see them in the library this week. I plan to talk today a bit about what we've learned in this course and the conceptual framework that we developed both to help us understand the moving target of German national identity, as well as the movements of people into and out of German space, and German in quotation marks here. As much as past and present German nationalists have affirmed an ethnically unmixed and geographically stable German people, German-speaking countries have, like almost anywhere else, been sites of movement. In fact, the worst moments in German history have arisen when barriers, both ideological and real, have sought to arrest this movement. For this reason, One of our starting points was a recent book by Thomas Nail entitled The Figure of the Migrant. And he opens, this book with a strong claim that the 21st century will be the century of the migrant. A claim that he supports not merely through reference to the very real movement of people from different geographical locations, but also through a consideration of the way movement has shaped our societies, continues to define, and will reshape them in the future. He coins the term kinopolitics, that is to say, the politics of movement, to describe this reality. The crux of Nail's argument is that conventional views on migrants and their movements are based on the presupposition of original stasis. He writes, I'm sorry about this. I'll read it for you. The migrant is often defined as the one who moves from country A to country B, from one fixed social point to another. The fixity of these social points is presupposed as primary, and the migrant is the one who temporarily lacks this fixity of social membership. In a world divided up into nation-states, each with strictly defined, although rarely impenetrable borders, someone who crosses a border is immediately at a disadvantage. The migrant is in many ways understood as either a failed citizen or as a stranger awaiting integration. In order to both understand the actual nature of migration and to mitigate these harmful associations, Nail asks that we rethink how we conceptualize movement itself. He argues that there are two ways of thinking about movement. There is movement understood as a change in place, whereby a journey from A to B requires stasis to be overcome for a short period before being regained. And this is the common sense model of migration from A to B. So simple, I didn't even bother with a failed diagram of it. In contrast, he develops the idea of flow. Oh, this one looks good. In which points A and B are simply moments when pre-existing motion appears to cease temporarily. Moments of stasis are, and he calls them junctions, mere eddies in an ongoing and extended movement. This is somewhat abstract, but we can read these different perspectives on movement in the very terms used to describe migrants, at least if we take a bit of time to look at the way they've shaped and remain implicit in the simple terms used for a refugee in German. And I won't delve too deeply into the etymologies of these words, but I do hope that by looking at them a little bit closer, it'll help you think about the terms we use in English. The most common term in German for refugee, the term with the longest history of widespread use, is the term Flüchtling. It's found in all kinds of official contexts. The Ministry of Migration and Refugees, for example, Bundesamt der Migration und Flüchtlinge, World Refugee Day, Weltflüchtlingstag, and it's the word used in the German Basic Law to translate the UN Charter relating to the status of refugees. The word is formed from the stem of the verb flüchten, to flee, and then appended the suffix ling, a diminutive form often implying some kind of dependency or immaturity, just like in English. In the majority of cases, it creates a noun from an already negative adjective, like here with der Schwächling, weakling, just like in English. It can also create a negative noun from an otherwise neutral verb, like with the verb schreiben, to write. Der Schreiberling is a hack or a scribbler. It even has the strength to take an entirely positive adjective, like schön, beautiful, and give it a negative meaning of pretty boy, someone who is too pretty in an unmasculine way. For these reasons, various alternatives are being used in Germany with increasing frequency. In the past 10 years, and with greater urgency since 2015, German officials are employing the term der Geflüchtete. The term avoids the negative connotations of Flüchtling and implies that for people so labeled, their movement is at an end. It's a participle form. They have fled, but now find themselves in a new static place, an asylum seeker's residence, for example. The same is true of der or die Geflohene. The act of fleeing, however, is not itself a completely neutral idea. There are obviously any number of reasons for an individual to take flight. Most of the people do as much as they can to stay before they make this decision, but the term does in some ways ask us to pass judgment on the validity of this decision to leave, and carries with it potentially a sense of cowardice, at least in German. Furthermore, it also defines individuals by an action that they have undertaken, a movement or decision that is actually no longer who they are. Another set of terms attempt to correct these infelicities. The terms der or die Schutzsuchende, a person in search of protection, or der die Zufluchtssuchende, a person in search of shelter, refuge, asylum, are gerundives, or present participles, used as nouns. And in these instances, they create a term, an identity that bears witness to the individual needs for protection, for refuge at present. Where these people are from and how they've come to be where they are no longer referenced. I read the shift in terminology as highly significant. For anyone uttering these terms, the emphasis shifts from a situation a person has left to what they need. More importantly, they place an implicit ethical demand on the person from whom refuge is sought. In the best case, these terms bypass the morass of regulations, state actors, and official legalese that occludes a basic human-to-human relationship. For example, the image of Alan Kurdi was a moment when this ethical responsibility for the other punctured general German apathy to the plight of Syrian refugees and brought about a new paradigm in Germany for accepting refugees. Similarly, the films we've been screening as part of the Weissberg Film Festival, and if any of you have seen them, you'll know what I'm talking about, force viewers to confront migrants face to face as human beings, rather than assess how well they fit within categories and what policies determine their entitlement to protection. They force us to confront how we are inclined to delegate our own ethical responsibility to our governments. Elfriede Jelinek, Austria's Nobel Prize-winning author, wrote a play about migration that places even greater emphasis on this sense of individual moral obligation and deconstructs the semantics behind which we too frequently hide. Her play considers the case of a group of asylum seekers who sought refuge in a Viennese church, that's the cross to symbolize that, and conflates this very visible demonstration with the thousands of migrants who die invisibly each year trying to cross the central Mediterranean to Italy. She titled the play Die Schutzbefohlenen, and that means people who are ordered into our care. And the archaic translation of this would probably be the wards, as in ward of the state. We owe these people protection. And the screening that I attended at Vienna's Burgtheater staged this whole play where the actors were ankle deep in water to really bring home the sense that there are realities of these people that we like to ignore, right? That this crisis in the Mediterranean is something we don't want to really look at. In all of this, and this quote is going to be a real disaster, I'm consistently reminded of the very strong ethical philosophy, and some would say completely untenable theory, of the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas is not alone in arguing that we are as humans fundamentally dependent on others, that self-consciousness, for example, itself cannot arise